Welcome to the fourth Better Work Tasmania networking session. Thank you for deciding to participate today, and this is in partnership with the Safety Institute of Australia. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Pam Atkinson from WorkSafe Tasmania, and today we have yet an exciting morning of information givers to cover the topic theme, Consultation and Engagement, Key Elements to Improving Work Health and Safety. Just to let you know about the two further networking sessions planned for Better Work for the first half of 2016. On the 27th of April, we're planning a session on dangerous substances, hazardous chemicals, with a highlight on the Global Harmonised System, GHS. And on the 8th of June, to that particular one, we're going to actually go out to members and hear what your suggestions might be for that particular session. So look out for that, members. We'll be asking for your thoughts. Now, before we proceed, I'd like to invite Ken Holmes from the Safety Institute of Australia to say a few words.
Thanks, Pam. Just very briefly, so this is the first seminar that we've been involved with jointly with Better Work Tasmania, so we're very pleased to actually do that. SIA is a member-based organisation, but we're not just there for our members. We really are there to strive for excellence in health and safety and get better outcomes for everybody. So we certainly like to get involved in running seminars and sessions so that we can spread the message and further improve safety and safety performance in the state. We're certainly keen to spread the message across Tasmania, and we have three regional networks, one in the north, one in the northwest, and one here in the south. So with that, if you're at all interested, details are on one of the banners. But more, it's about supporting really good sessions with the people on here this morning. So I look forward to the presentations to come. Thanks.
So with that, and to ensure that we stick to the time schedule, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Heather Baker Goldsmith. Heather is an experienced WHS practitioner with an excess of 25 years working in a range of roles in industry and government. She spent 18 years working with WorkSafe Victoria in both operational strategic roles and in the development of policy, strategy and inspection services. She has extensive experience as a senior manager responsible for safety improvement in both the public and private sectors, and undertaken a range of inspection, investigation and prosecution activities of the regulator. So I'd like you all to welcome Heather.
Thanks, Pam. I'd like to thank WorkSafe and the SIA for the opportunity to speak to you all this morning and to talk about consultation, which has been in recent years particularly a big part of the work that I do. Consultation is a legal obligation. We're all comfortable with that, but the fact is the legal obligation part of it is only part of the picture. There's a whole range of reasons why people in workplaces, why organisations, employers make investments in implementing health and safety measures, and to oversimplify to some extent, you can group them into three sort of areas. One's the legal obligation. It is a legal obligation, it's the law. But as a motivator, legal obligations are fairly limited in their ability to gain commitment from people. There's a moral obligation. People who are decision makers in organisations are people at the end of the day. Most people want to do the right thing. Most people think of themselves as good people who care about other people. And so there's a moral imperative as a motivator for some of these things. And at the end of the day, it's just good business management to actually invest in compliance, and better than compliance if you can manage it, in terms of health and safety. It manages losses from damage to equipment, downtime, injury, compensation costs, poor workplace relations, disputations, a whole range of reasons why it's just good business to manage your health and safety properly. And consultation is not just a key part of those legal obligations, it's actually about engaging with your people so that there is true partnership in implementing health and safety measures in workplaces. So the objective of consultation is It improves health and safety. It leads to better decisions. More information into decisions can only improve the outcomes of decision-making processes. And it promotes acceptance and support of decisions. So in terms of change management in workplaces, when you're trying to implement something or change something, you need the commitment and the engagement of your people if it's truly going to be successful. So as a lever in change management in organisations, consultation on health and safety is a real boon. You'll have to excuse me, I'm used to having the screen in front of me as well as up there, and I can only see it up there. And how do I know what I think until I hear what I say? And taking account of all relevant perspectives on an issue is just good management. You know, none of us know it all. And let's face it, the people who know the most about how work is done in the workplace are the people who do it. The people who know what the problems are going to be, know what's going to work and what isn't going to work, know what unintended consequences might flow from what somebody else thinks is a really good idea. So it's just good management to take account of all the relevant inputs. I'll try standing up this way a bit better. This is a bit of a motherhood statement that's one of the underpinning principles around making consultation a legal obligation. It was embedded in health and safety legislation in Australia from back in the 80s, but just sort of as an ad hoc part of another duty, whereas more recent legislation actually creates consultation as a duty in itself. Consultation's regular two-way communication between employer and employees, including contractors. As you know, that's the extended definition of an employee. It's an opportunity for employee input prior to decisions being made that affect them. The employer will ultimately make the decision about what happens in the workplace. The employer has the right and indeed the obligation to take responsibility for decisions that are made in the workplace. So engaging in a consultation process isn't a matter of industrial democracy or handing over decision making to workers. The employer will still make those decisions as a matter of law. But they will make better decisions if they have more input into it. So this is the legal obligation, which all of you are aware of, and I'm presuming that, you know, because I have a strong regulatory background, it's good for me to actually establish the framework for you, for our subsequent speakers to then go on and talk more broadly about how you engage with that. But that's what the Act actually says. And this notion of a PCBU, I'm sure you're all aware of this anyway, but I'd just like to take the opportunity to make the point. There's no new duties under this harmonised legislation. Every legal obligation that was in previous legislation is in the new one, but some of the words have changed. There's actually one new duty, but it doesn't, you know, it's just a rewording of an old one, but everything else is the same. And I still have clients of mine, particularly smaller ones, who say, oh, what am I going to do now that I'm a PCBU? I've got all of these obligations, you know. And a PCBU is not a new entity, it's just a term that picks up everybody who had a duty. So we can use one term instead of saying an employer, a self-employed person, a blah, 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 blah. We say a person conducting a business or undertaking. But in virtually every place that PCBU appears in the legislation, it just means employer. And so if we talk about employers and workers, you know that I'm talking about PCBUs because, you know, they're not new. So the Act sets out what you have to consult about, who you have to consult, what consultation has to include, that is what it looks like if you're going to be doing it, and the role of health and safety reps. And an employer has to consult so far as is reasonably practicable, and that means what's reasonably practicable in the circumstances. Now, I know that I don't have to teach all of you how to read legislation. You can read legislation. I'm hoping that some of my insights that I have might help you a little bit. So if we look at consult so far as is reasonably practicable, some people interpret that to mean, well, if it's not reasonably practicable, I don't have to consult. That's kind of like saying, if it's not reasonably practicable to control the risk, then I don't have to control it. Neither of those statements is actually true. What the law says is you must consult to the extent that it's reasonably practicable. So, for example, it will be much more practicable to consult with people who are in your workplace every day than it will be to consult with people who perhaps, you know, come and go such as, labour hire workers or whatever, So that's what it means, to the extent that it's reasonably practicable, not whether or not you have to consult. You always have to consult, but you just are allowed to make decisions about how far you have to go. And it's exactly the same when you're looking at controlling risks. Technically, you always have to control risk in workplaces if you're the duty holder, but so far as is reasonably practicable says how far you have to go in particular circumstances. So I hope that's some use, that insight. These are all of the things that the legislation says you have to consult about. Again, you can read the law, you don't need me to read it to you. But, some of the things that people don't necessarily recognise are things like deciding who will be on a health and safety committee. If you set up a health and safety committee, you're required to consult about what the membership of that committee will be. Even though it's an employer that sets up a committee, the Act says what a committee looks like, who's allowed to be on it, etc. And it says you have to consult about that. But the biggest one is really around change. Anything that you propose to change that it may affect health or safety, you need to consult about. So who do you have to consult? Employees who are directly affected or are likely to be directly affected by it. One insight that I can give you there is that, notice it doesn't say that the effect might be negative. So if you anticipate there might be a negative effect, you have to consult. No, you may be making a change that, in your view, will have a positive effect on people. It doesn't matter whether it's a positive or a negative effect. If it directly affects or is likely to directly affect people, then the Act says they're entitled to be consulted. You have to consult with independent contractors and employees of those contractors because of that extended definition in the legislation around who is a worker. And a worker includes an independent contractor and their employees. Again, if you look at that, the particular circumstances you're consulting on will influence what it's reasonably practicable for you to do to consult contractors or their employees. And even, indeed, whether or not you need to consult contractors or their employees. Because if they're not likely to be directly affected by what you're proposing to implement or to change or to do, then you don't have to consult them. Also, don't forget that their employer has a duty to consult them as well. So a lot of the time when you're consulting with contractors, you will be consulting with them through their employer. So there's no expectation that you will go and chase down every labour hire worker that works for a particular organisation to make sure that they know about your changes to site access or whatever it is you're changing. Consulting with their employer is sufficient because they have their own obligation to consult with their people. So that's an important thing to remember as well. If workers are represented by health and safety representatives, the Act says those representatives must be involved in those consultations. So you can't consult with workers directly instead of consulting with their health and safety representative. You must consult with the health and safety representative as part of that process. Anything that relates to affects or is likely to directly affect people that they represent. So they may not be in the group of people who are likely to be directly affected, but they may in fact be the representative for those people, in which case they need to be consulted. Most organisations that develop positive, proactive consultation systems consult through their health and safety representatives. You have a framework of representation there in your workplace. If you have health and safety representatives, the most effective and efficient way often to consult with workers is through that framework that already exists, rather than to seek to create another one. But we'll touch on that a little bit more later. But their involvement is a legal requirement. Why is it so important? As I said before, the people who know the most about work and how it's done is the people who do it. It improves the decision making when you're actually making decisions around things that impact on health and safety. It reduces disputation in your workplace. You know, if you're going to have a problem with something from an industrial point of view, for example, you're going to find out about it on the way through the consultation process, not after you've already implemented it and spent a whole bunch of money and now you've got a fight on your hands because somebody's raised an issue you didn't think of. It does bring about greater cooperation and commitment in your workplace to health and safety if people feel that they're engaged in the process. It's just a part of good health and safety management, and of course it's a legal requirement, as we said. The final decision, as I touched on before, will always reside with the duty holder in the workplace. The fact that employees have been consulted doesn't mean that they share responsibility if decisions turn out to be poor. Well, we consulted with them and they seem to think it was okay. You know, at the end of the day, we're all comfortable with the notion that the duties under this legislation aren't transferable to anybody else. They are absolute duties and you can't give them to someone else. And at the end of the day, consulting about something, excuse me, doesn't mean that the people you consulted with share responsibility. They don't. Workers and their representatives should be involved in the decision-making process and their views taken into account, and that's what underpins the provision in the legislation. But what if people don't agree? One of the ways that consultation bogs down is if people say, well, you know, what's this? I have to go out and get, you know, everybody to tick off on something before I can change something in the workplace. No, that's not what it means, and it doesn't mean everybody has to agree with everything. Consultation is a good outcome of agreement is a good outcome of consultation, but sometimes it's not possible to get agreement on something. And at the end of the day, an employer is free to make decisions about what happens in their workplace, provided those decisions comply with the law. What's important about gaining commitment through a consultation process is that it's a genuine process that identifies when consultation is required, reliably engages people in the process, meets the requirements of sharing information and so on, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, and that people are told at the end of the day. The fact that people don't like it isn't really an issue. Where an employer is required to consult, they have to do so by sharing information about the matter on which they're being consulted. This is straight out of the Act and paraphrased. Giving employees a reasonable opportunity to express their views. What's reasonable in the circumstances, again, will vary depending. If you work in a place where everybody's there every day, a couple of weeks to think about something might be fine. If you work in an organisation that has shift works, where there are weeks where certain people aren't there for 2 weeks or whatever, you need to take that into account to make sure that everybody has an opportunity. So what's reasonable will be different in different circumstances. You have to take the views of people into account. Doesn't mean you have to do what people want, but the law says you have to take their views into account, and we'll talk about how you demonstrate that in a second. You have to consult workers about the procedures for consultation. So if you don't actually have a consultation process in your workplace, the first thing the law says you have to do is you have to consult about how you're going to consult. And that sounds like a tautology, but it actually makes sense if you think about it. And it's a good way to kick off a consultation process by starting out with consulting about how you're going to consult. This is how we're going to do things in our workplace. This is what we propose, how we propose to manage consultation. What do you think? And consult on how you're going to consult. If I have time at the end, I have a couple of examples that I've helped put together of a framework for a consultation model. If you reach agreement on a consultation model, by which, you know, you put something out, and I think in Victoria they use the notion of if 75% of the people agree, you can say you've got agreement. I suspect that might come from an industrial environment, but anyway, if people agree to it through a formal agreement process, then you have to follow it because it becomes an agreed procedure on consultation. And then you can get into trouble if you don't follow your own procedure. So you don't have to have an agreed procedure, but agreed procedures at least provide some certainty for everybody who's involved. You know what's going to happen, you know how it's going to be managed, etc. It reduces disputation and miscommunication when you've got an issue on foot. It's always best to agree on these things in abstract with no issue on foot, because once you've got an issue on foot, it becomes a bit partisan. Obviously, as I said before, if there are health and safety reps in the workplace, they have to be involved. Health and safety committees are also a valuable way to consult if you have health and safety committees in place. Normally, in most workplaces, health and safety representatives are on health and safety committees, so that might be part of your mechanism of working through reps. But in some workplaces that have a lot of health and safety reps, only some reps may be on the committee and not others, so you can't just go through a committee process if it excludes other health and safety reps. So there's a little bit of thinking to be done around that. And a health and safety committee, if you don't have one, must be established within 3 months if a health and safety representative asks for a health and safety committee to be set up. Now, just to work through this issue of, how you identify the people, I've just got a really rough example here. Got a workplace with a loading bay where their products loaded on trucks by forklifts. You have truck loading, unloading, etc. The employer wants to change the layout and the work process to remove the need for trucks to reverse, given there are lots of incidents of forklift trucks doing a quick swing around and crushing truck drivers against the side of their trucks or whatever. Good practice to have a process where forklifts don't have to reverse. It'll change the traffic flow, it'll change the job of the forklift drivers, and it'll change access to parts of the loading bay. So that's a change that's likely to directly affect the health or safety of people who work in this area and who come into this area, so it has to be consulted about before you do it. So who has to be consulted? You have to consult with employees who are likely to be directly affected. I've talked about what does reasonably practicable mean. And just to touch on this issue of urgency, one of the things you have to consult about is when you identify risks, assess risks, and make decisions about how you'll control them. So if suddenly a big hole opens up in the loading bay in the floor because there's subsidence, there's no suggestion that you should have to go through a consultation process to decide whether that's dangerous or not, and whether we should put a fence around it or not, and whether we should fix it or not. Of course you don't. If there are urgent issues, you get on and you fix them. But in line with the consultation duty, you actually let people know. There was this issue, we had to do something, this is what we've done, this is what we're thinking about doing to fix it, for good. What do you reckon? That's your consultation process, and it's happening as soon as possible after. So, who do we consult here? People who work in the loading bay, forklift drivers, dispatch staff, etc. People who've got need to come into the area, truck drivers, forklift maintenance staff, office staff who enter as a part of their work. Any contractors or their employees who enter, like transport contractors, maintenance contractors, etc. So in this example, those are the people that you would need to consult with. You have to, this is what does an employer have to do? You have to make sure, I can't see this thing. Just to touch on employee duties, we've talked about some of the employer duties. And of course, given that most of the control in workplaces rests with the employer has the significant duties in workplaces, the big ones and the most important ones, but that's not to say that workers don't have duties as well. They have to make sure they don't do anything that could put themselves or others at risk of illness or injury, but the Act qualifies that they have to do what it's within their capability to do, what it's within their capacity to do. So if they're not the decision makers on some things, you can't hold them responsible when the decision was poor, really. They don't have anything like the same duty as the decision makers. They're not to interfere with or misuse anything that's been provided in the interests of health or safety, which includes using CO2 fire extinguishers to cool your cans of Coke, or taking guards off machines because it's easier than putting them back on or whatever. They're also required to cooperate with their employer in the actions they take to keep the workplace safe, or to implement their duties under the legislation. So in relation to consultation, it means that there's an expectation that employees will engage with consultation processes in a positive and constructive way. They don't have a specific duty in relation to consultation because it's the employer's duty, but in general, they are required to cooperate with their employer. So these are the three things that the law says have to be done. Share information, ensuring people have a reasonable opportunity to comment, and have regard to their input before you make a decision. You can share information a whole range of ways. You might set up briefing sessions, you might if you're consulting through health and safety reps, you might brief all of the health and safety reps and give them all the information and then allow them to go out and talk to the people they represent and gather their feedback and bring it back. But you need to talk about, this is what we're proposing to do, this is why we're proposing to do it. You might even go to, well, this is why we're doing this rather than that, because that kind of heads off some confusion around it. You tell people what's the mechanism for feedback and what's the timeline. So I always try to encourage employers to have someone who owns the consultation. So if we're talking about the forklifts we're talking about a minute ago, it might be the manager of the warehouse, the distribution warehouse. They're going to be managing these changes in the process. They should manage the consultation. So people know who they have to go to, who'll know what they're talking about, who can answer their questions, etc. That needs to be clearly communicated on the way through. And consultation should be active rather than passive, by which I mean, if an employer says, I consulted with everybody because we sent out a global email to all of our workers asking them to give us comment and nobody answered, I can take that as agreement. No, you can't really. You know, leaving things on the notice board so that people might see them, you know, printing out things and putting them on the table in the tea room, really, these are all passive forms of consultation. You need to do a bit better than that to actually engage people. So I'm keeping an eye on my clock. So sharing information is the first step in that process. Then people have to have an opportunity to comment, sufficient time and opportunity to consider the information, to ask questions, provide suggestions and feedback. And as I said, you know, set a reasonable time frame. It's good to agree on the time frame at the front end, if you can, then everybody knows, yep, you know, in 3 weeks they're going to make the decision, so we've got this long to input into it, etc. The more potentially significant the impact on people might be, probably the further you need to go in relation to making sure people have the opportunity to input and to be provided with information. How do you show that you've had regard for people's input? Well, the best way to do that is to provide feedback to people. So you won't ever convince people that you've had regard to their input if everybody asks questions, puts suggestions in, etc., and then you just come straight back and say, nah, heard all that, sorry, we're going to do this anyway. Much better if you're able to, you don't have to give people individual feedback. In small workplaces you might, but in large workplaces there's nothing wrong with, you know, putting out a report at the end of the consultation process to say, this is what we've decided to do for these reasons. A number of people suggested this, but we can't do that for these reasons. A number of people raised that, but we're not really persuaded by that, we think this is better. So you are actually demonstrating you heard. You're not necessarily doing what people want, but you're telling them that you heard. And that's not hard to do, and it's the way that you demonstrate compliance in relation to this. And you have to clearly communicate the decision at the end of the day. Tell people what the outcome was, rather than just have processes that are constantly sending stuff out saying, what do you think, and nobody ever hears whatever happened about any of that stuff. Well, they mustn't have liked what we thought because we never heard about it any more about it. So it just gives people a sense of not being managed and the organisation not being organised. What about contractors? We all know what contractors are. People who are employed under a contract of service rather than a contract of employment. So they may be contractors who come to the workplace often because they're the contractors who do all of our maintenance or all of our electrical or whatever. But the nature of the relationship with them is not a contract of employment. But under health and safety legislation has never been concerned about who pays the wages. It's concerned with who controls the risk. So it's always been, since at least 1970, proactive legislation that is about who controls the risk. So people may be paid by somebody else, but if they're in your workplace doing your work subject to your working conditions and under your direction, then you control the risk. And that's why health and safety legislation has broadened out that definition of who is a worker for health and safety purposes. How do you consult them? As I said, most likely you would consult. First you need to make a decision whether they are likely to be affected by your decision making, and then you would consult them through their employment structure. As I said, there's no... If they happen to be on site when you're briefing your own staff, you wouldn't exclude them. You'd include them in that. But in a more general sense, you need to engage with their employer as part of your consultation process. And we know that health and safety reps have to be involved. My button's not working. Oh, there we go. Oh, now it's working too well. Okay, well, we're right. Perhaps my battery's just a bit dodgy. Where there are no health and safety representatives, and you don't have to have health and safety representatives in your workplace, but if there aren't any, workers may want to put forward one of their group to actually streamline the consultation process. And there's nothing wrong with that, and that would be a good idea, but that person wouldn't be a health and safety representative unless they'd been elected under the legislation. So how does this fit with issue resolution? It doesn't. It runs alongside issue resolution. The fact that people have been consulted about something doesn't mean that they give up the right to have a problem with it at the end of the day. So they're quite separate processes, and what some organisations do is blur those two things together in a way that's really not helpful. Health and safety reps still have their normal rights and powers under the legislation, whether or not they've been consulted. And I'll give you a quick example, I think, in a minute of where that might be an issue. There are two ways an employer might fail to comply in consultation. Not consulting in accordance with the Act would be one way that you could fail to comply. It's unlikely to be an offence that a regulator is going to prosecute you for, but they might write notices requiring you to follow the process because it's a legal requirement. And also that the decision at the end of the day doesn't comply with the law. Because the fact is, an employer is entitled to make decisions about how their business operates, provided those decisions are consistent with the law. So, looking at consultation procedures, for example, you can't put in place a procedure that doesn't comply with the law, whether or not people agree with it. You know, you could have what you propose as an agreed procedure for issue resolution that says we all agree not to go to our health and safety rep if we've got a problem because we'll just go to management and we won't involve the health and safety rep. People can't agree to something that is not consistent with the law. So the fact that people have agreed with it doesn't matter, and that's the same in relation to consultation. Just as an aside, I can't tell you how many times as an inspector, when we first brought in plant regulations in Victoria that required risk assessment of plant, how many times my people would go out to workplaces and an employer would say, no, we don't need to put a guard on that machine. Well, we did a risk assessment and we decided there wasn't any risk. So, you know, the process is only part of it. It's meant to lead you to a proper outcome. So in our example, they redesigned the workplace. They actually got complete separation of pedestrians and mobile equipment in that area, and they actually got quantifiable productivity improvements out of it. And I have to tell you, working in this field for a very long time now, there aren't too many health and safety improvements that you can't find a productivity improvement or a savings in if you don't look for it. It's amazing. And you've got high levels of compliance and of people, you know, making other people comply because they were all involved in this. They were all involved in owning that there was a problem, involved in working out, you know, what we could do about it, and then working out how we can implement it. And everybody in that loading dock owns that process, and they've got high levels of compliance and no incidents since they changed it. This is just a quick example of where you might have a health and safety rep engaged in a slightly different way. And employers, you know, possibly engaged a consultant, dare I say, who's come along with an image consultant who said, no, look, our logo is like this. We should change everybody's PPE to be navy blue because it goes so much better with our corporate logo than those fawn-coloured things that they wear. So the company's decided to change the colour of overalls. And overalls are personal protective equipment, so it puts it in the safety realm and something that needs to be consulted about. So the employer needs to consult about that. They need to provide opportunity for input. Well, employees generally don't like the navy blue overalls. They hate them. Their wife doesn't like washing navy blue. Navy blue shows every little bit of dust and dirt, and I'd never look good in navy blue. So they don't like it. They don't want to change their overalls. They think it's a bit sad, you know, all these dark colours. So they tell the employer, saying, look, could we have some other... If you don't want the fawn colour, let's have something else, but a bit lighter. The navy blue's shocking, you know. And the employer comes back and says, well, look, you know, I've heard what you said, but, you know, we've paid all this money to this consultant who's told us that our logo will look so much better on navy blue. So we've decided to go ahead with the navy blue overalls, and they're arriving on Monday. And they communicate this decision to employees. And as I said, the employer is entitled to decide what uniform people wear to work, provided it complies with the law. However, the health and safety rep and some employees are concerned that by putting people in all these navy blue clothes, they're actually introducing a risk in a whole bunch of areas of the workplace because they're going to be hard to see in low light. And I know they can put high-vis vests on, but, you know, they see that as an issue. They've introduced a risk. So the health and safety rep is entitled to raise this as a health and safety issue. So even though they've been through a consultation process, at the end of the day, a health and safety rep would be saying, yep, they consulted, don't have a problem with the consultation process, but what they want to do doesn't comply with the law. So does that make sense to everybody? So that's kind of where the consultation and issue resolution can run side by side. Similarly, you have issues where people want to take woolly hats off people who work in the snow because they think peaked caps look more professional. At the end of the day, those hats in the snow are part of their protective clothing. They're entitled to be consulted about it. They were consulted in this particular case. They decided we like the peaked caps anyway. And that issue was raised by a health and safety rep as taking warm woolly hats off people who work in the snow and on boats and in low temperatures, etc., was actually a risk to their health or safety, and the regulator agreed with them, so that issue was resolved. So you had an employer who went through a consultation process to an outcome, but the outcome was changed for health and safety reasons. Was that me? Who made that ding? As I said, you don't have to have agreed procedures. The Act provides for them, but if you have an agreed procedure, at least it means, as I said, you can tailor it to your particular workplace, so it doesn't have to be more complex than it needs to be. Let's face it, most consultation processes in small workplaces are about the foreman or the boss talking to people at a toolbox meeting and saying, look, we're thinking about getting a new forklift, we thought we'd get one of these, what do you reckon? Here's the pamphlet for the 3 we looked at. Let us know by the end of the week what you think, because we need to organise to get the forklift in. You know, that's what most consultation processes will be. But in large organisations, they can get a bit out of hand if you don't know up front what you're going to do. So as I said, you have to consult about how you're going to consult, and that may or may not lead to an agreement. Doesn't have to, but if it does lead to an agreement, you have to use the process that you agreed to after that. And it's a good idea to involve employees and their representatives in drafting an initial cut of a consultation model to consult on. Because if it's just something that's constantly being fed out from the organisation, then it really does reinforce that us and them, you know, they want us to do this, so now we get to have input back into it. If people can be involved in coming up with a draft to put out, that can make a big difference. There's a number of challenges in dealing with consultation. One is consistently and reliably identifying when consultation's required. So people can say, oh yeah, like I get that, that's not a problem, I understand. We'll have something in place to manage consultation. And then, you know, the very next day, someone does something and doesn't think they need to consult anybody about it. And then workers sit back and say, well, they're not fair income, are they? They said they'd consult with us, and look, you know, while we were away on holidays, they changed all the furniture around in our office area because, you know, they thought it looked better another way. Well, that's a change to our working environment that may affect our health or safety. Excuse me, we were entitled to be consulted about it before they did it. not just come in and find it's already been done. So it alienates people, and that sort of thing happens in workplaces with the best of intentions simply because nobody's managing this, nobody's got their head around it, and things happen without any sort of malice or ill will, but they undermine the relationships in the workplace. People don't trust after a while. Managing consultation at the right level. In terms of health and safety management, there's always been this tension between health and safety specialists, health and safety professionals, and organisational management. So I'm sure many of you, hopefully not now, but have worked in organisations where they say, oh, well, that's health and safety. We've got a health and safety manager, that's their job. No, we don't have to worry about that. We've got a health and safety officer, that's his job. And we know, of course, that health and safety in organisations isn't happening unless it's being done by every person in a management or supervisory role. Everybody all the way down the line. Now, supervisors and managers in organisations aren't the employer. The employer's duty is up here. But the only way that an employer can meet its duty is through its line management. There is no other way, because they're the people every day who are deciding who does what, with what, when they do it, what support they get, how quickly they have to do it, what training they're going to have, what level of supervision they need. These are decisions that are being made every day by line managers. So if they're not delivering your health and safety program, then it ain't happening, because it can't be delivered from the centre and sent out in memos. It actually has to be delivered by all of those people. As I said, an employer meets their duty through their line management structure. And how they do that is not by trying to give managers and supervisors the employer's duty, because they can't, the duties can't be transferred, but by actually making it part of their job, giving them the training and the support to enable them to do it, giving them access to an internal or external resource like a health and safety professional who can help them, support them, answer their questions, etc., and holding them accountable when they don't, making it part of their performance assessment of how they manage health and safety as part of it as well. That's how an employer does it. So if you think that all of your consultation in an organisation, particularly a medium to large one, is going to be managed from the centre, it's just not going to work, because the centre doesn't know what's going on most of the time. The centre doesn't know that a guy out at a workplace out here has decided to get a plumber in to change around the toilets or something, things that need to be consulted about, but the centre isn't actually across it. But the people out there are seething because they said they'd consult with us, and now they're not consulting with us about something that clearly we're entitled to be consulted about. So managing it at the right level and empowering those levels to be able to do it is a key element. Engaging line managers in the process. Apart from anything else, it actually enhances their role with their people. It makes them knowledgeable, it makes them the person to go to with a question or whatever, and it enhances their role in the organisation. So once they get their heads around they're not being given an extra job because it's already part of their job, most people are willing to take that on. Perhaps I'm not pushing hard enough, Paul. Doesn't like me. Oh. Utilising the involvement of health and safety reps, I've talked about that. And ensuring ownership and accountability for consultation, so that when you have a consultation process and you identify who's the person who's going to manage it, then everybody knows Bill's managing that process. So he's the go-to guy, he'll chase up extra information, you need whatever. If you don't have anybody owning it, it just becomes some loose process that waltzes around the organisation. As I said at the beginning, there are a lot of cultural levers that come out of consultation in terms of improving engagement and commitment within your organisation. And it's a very big thing in a lot of workplaces for employees to actually see, they say it's their managers walking the talk, to actually see people doing the things that they say that they will do, like demonstrating real commitment to involving workers in things, that people actually above them do care about them, but also care about what they can contribute and value their input into it. Even if they don't take on board the things that they want them to do, the fact that they cared enough to listen to them is a huge thing in building positive culture in workplaces. And you'll never get people, workers, to sign on to health and safety in your workplace if they don't believe the people above them are committed to it as well. So, by my account, I have 3 minutes left. If anybody's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Also, if anybody wants to leave me a business card, I'm happy to send them a copy of this presentation. And I said I had we might actually put it up. Paul, is it Paul? The consultation model, if you could put that up, that just might be useful for people to have a glance at it. I'm happy to send that to anybody if it's helpful as well. So does anybody have a question they want to ask me? Oh. Yeah.
Just thinking about your consultation, and a lot of the examples seem to work well in a single site organisation.
Yep.
The workers and the management team.
Yep.
All on that work site.
Yep.
Thinking about my company, for example, where there's multiple work sites in several states throughout Australia with a corporate hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes they want every work site to make it feel and look the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so that makes it sometimes quite difficult with consultation at local site level where there's a
Yes.
corporate approach and one work site might really embrace that and be quite happy with a change in uniform or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
The other work sites quite adverse to that.
Mm-hmm.
The corporate hierarchy want them all to look and feel the same, have the same policies and procedures.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that or you can counter that.
It creates a challenge for the OHS specialist on site to try to make that work, because at the end of the day, an employer doesn't get to say, everybody else in our company likes the blue overalls. Do you know what I mean? At the end of the day, people are entitled to have that duty met in their workplace, whether or not their workplace is part of a huge organisation. And it might be a challenge for someone in your role to actually try to work out how we can have consistency, if not uniformity. So how might we be able to, you know, meet some of those expectations for consistency while still being able to build in a little bit of individuality that says to our people, we heard you. And that's a challenge. But health and safety people are used to challenges like that. Influencing other people and getting commitment out of other people is you know, the big part of what we do. So this is an example of a consultation model that I helped an organisation work out, and it has some of those same things in it. A consultation policy or a consultation model that you put out to people to say, what do you think, is basically like a policy statement of saying, this is how we're going to do it. You can't anticipate every single thing that you might have to consult about, but you can say, as an organisation, in general, this is what we'll do. We'll always give you at least 2 weeks' notice unless it's urgent. And if it's urgent, we'll tell you it's urgent and we can't give you 2 weeks' notice. But you'll always get a minimum of 2 weeks. We're never going to do 3 days on you, you know? So that's just my timer telling me that I've run out of time. Oh, shut up. So you can talk make those sorts of general commitments that virtually anything will fit into. And it says, you know, your managers are the people you have the most direct access to. They're the people who are going to be managing consultation with you. So, again, I'm happy to send a copy of that to anybody. But in terms of a large organisation, and I think I can talk about this in general, can't I, Mark, in terms of the consultation model. Relatively recently, I did a major piece of work with Tasmania Police and the Police Association Tasmania, developing a consultation model for police. And again, you have a large organisation, you have very disparate little workplaces all over the place, you have a high level of engagement by people, you have health and safety reps, you have a command structure. You know, it is quite a complex structure to get your head around in terms of how you can reliably get consultation on health and safety matters happening in that organisation. But we did. and we got an agreement in relation to consultation, and there's now an agreed procedure which is published. I think it's actually in a booklet form, isn't it? Geoff, you said you'd seen a book? Oh, well, I've got a copy of it. Well, I even get a thank you in the published document. But again, that is a difficult work environment. It's by any estimate, a very controlled environment. It's virtually paramilitary, but it's a high-risk environment and a very dispersed group of people, and we got an agreed consultation model that everybody is happy with. So it can be done. And I think I'm out of time, Pam. I'm happy to hang around and talk to anybody who'd like to talk after we finish. Thanks very much. It was a lot of information in a short time. I hope I didn't bore you rigid.
Thanks very much, Heather. Very interesting. I'd like to now introduce Jimmy Stewart, our next speaker. Jimmy is a chartered engineer with over 23 years' experience in safety engineering and risk management. He has gained significant operational risk management experience in high hazardous environments or deployed on active service with the military, and recently provided dynamic risk assessment training to the Australian Navy. He is an advocate of practical safety solutions that offer real value to risk-based decision-making around, so far as reasonably practicable, demonstration and compliance. Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm not going to stand up there because of the issues with the... I need to use the mic up. Can everyone hear me? Everyone hear you? Fantastic. I'm up here. It's quite ironic, actually. Engagement. One of the key tenets... Sorry, we're recording. So okay. One of the key tenets of safety is communication, and I'm up here in my best Australian accent. So if I am missing or people I'm losing some people, please stop me. And this is a workshop environment for me, really. So this is a two-way piece for the whole of the presentation. So engagement, it really clutches in nicely, Heather, to your presentation. And I'm going to use a couple of those hooks in order to demonstrate some of the conceptual models that I've built, because I think it sometimes can be a complex environment. It can be that complex that we confuse ourselves with terminology and words. Therefore, I try to turn it into pictures, so hopefully you'll be pleased to know that there's actually no words in this presentation at all. It's all pictures. So let me just get this thing working so I know it. So I think I'm the only safety professional in the world that's using minions to demonstrate compliance to the obligations in the Act. But I do like them, and I like them for a couple of reasons, and I'll explain that in a second. So, which can be sometimes a very complicated environment. I use a Nancy Leveson diagram. Nancy Leveson, she's actually an astronaut, and I use this diagram to really get the ground rules. What are the rules? Heather clearly articulated some of the obligations and the rules that are applicable to an organisation, workplace health and safety. And I've kind of took a bit of a slant on that to make people connect so that we can engage. Where do I fit in? What do I need to do? So I'm using a Nancy Leveson diagram. What it's saying here, this diagram, is this is our organisation. This is our organisation here, and I've split it into 3 levels. The strategic level, the operational level, and the tactical level. Because workplace health and safety obligations mean different things to different people. It depends where you sit in the organisation, really, of what those obligations are and how you exercise those obligations. So we've got to recognise that. There's a whole bunch of external factors here that flow into the organisation. A whole bunch of drivers like political, economical, regulatory environments. The safety obligations and the safety rule books come from the Workplace Health and Safety Act. What that means is the organisation has been steered like a ship by winds blowing it in a certain direction. So when we distill these rules from the Act into your organisation, we take a book, we put our stamp on it, and we just let people know what that means to us in our organisation. Like the Work Safe Tasmania book. If I was Work Safe Tasmania, I dilute the obligations from the Act, I put a stamp on it and say, this is what it means to us, guys and ladies. This is what the obligations means to us. So how do we get people to follow them, and how do we engage in that? Well, what I normally do is I start with say, okay, then let's understand the obligations of a PCBU. There's very few rules, actually, in the Act. And once you get your head around them, they're easy to communicate and actually communicate effectively. The first thing is, the obligations of a PCBU is a primary duty of care. Well, what does that mean? Well, we can go in the Act and look at that, but actually, there's a primary duty of care for people, process, and plant. And those obligations are quite differently. But the standard to which a PCBU is judged is the same. It's reasonably practicable. That's the standard. That's the standard to which the PCBU is judged. And as we come into the organisation, there's key actors within the organisation. And those key actors, depending on their accountability and responsibility, will have a different take and a different slant on the rulebook. And the reason I use the minion is because he's got one big eye on his head, and he's looking at the organisation from a different perspective. If you're sat at this level of organisation, this level of organisation, or this level of organisation, which means we can't have a one-size-fits-all safety management plan. We've got to tell people where they fit in. So at the strategic level, officers who are accountable and who can make decisions that affect whole or part of the organisation, they've got more responsibility, more accountability, and quite rightly so. They dictate the type of activity the organisation will do. They dictate that through these economic, political drivers, and indeed labour trends. Therefore, they've got a due diligence lens, and they'll look at the organisation through a due diligence lens. And like, as Heather said, often or not, they don't really understand what's happening at the operational layer, or indeed the worker layer, the tactical layer. What that means is we've got to exercise that due diligence obligations through middle management. So if you're not an officer and you're not held accountable to the due diligence standard, then you're a worker. But you can be a supervisor, a senior manager, a middle manager, or just someone following process. So how I put it, I say, okay then, well, you have a barometer. You have a reasonable care barometer. And it depends where you sit in an organisation as to how far that barometer comes up in terms of reasonable care. And we can spend a whole half day actually unpacking your individual reasonable care barometer. Because what it means is we can take examples from the floor and we can say, well, you fit in here, and your reasonable care barometer is here. And actually, you fit in here, up here somewhere, because you've got accountability and management accountability, and you're at the front line of workplace health and safety implementation, and you've got to balance productivity with safety. So I can tell you your barometer fits. And this is a really easy way of explaining what can be a complex environment without actually having to open the rule book, the Act, and dilute it. The only other standard, I suppose, in terms of primary duty of care, if you have some upstream duties here of a PCBU, and those upstream duties, if you design, manufacture, you import, you supply, or you commission, and there's a standard there called reasonable foreseeable risk. And that's just really managing the communication environment and passing on that risk. It's quite a complex diagram, well, not really, but actually we can draw it here. This is the exact same diagram we use in the sites, in the field, at health and safety rep meetings, and actually really just looks at the Nancy Levison diagram, and people then understand where they fit in. And if people understand where they fit in, well, the chances are they'll follow the rules, and you just make it relevant. So one of the first case in points is, how do we engage? Well, we've got to make it relevant. Maybe not use minions, maybe use something that your organisation does. But it's actually a really neat model in order to communicate and make this stuff relevant. So any questions in that? No? Do you like the minions? Yeah, I've got to admit, I do like them. Sorry?
Look like Collingwood supporters.
Fantastic. So in terms of understanding the rules, and not to dilute the rules, and obviously just to complement the stuff you were saying, is, you know, engagement for me is a shade of grey. And we can turn that engagement piece darker shades of grey until we get full action. But it could be just making people aware. It could be just getting people to start talking about it in the crew rooms, at lunch breaks, at toolbox talks. Because if people talk about it, then they'll more or less follow the sort of behaviour patterns that you're actually trying to exercise. This is another little mental model. What I try and do is build a series of mental models in people's heads, because often or not with safety, what I believe is the lexicon, the language you use often confuses people. And when I build a mental model of the rules, that's what I see in my head. But maybe somebody sees a massive manual, a whole bunch of clauses and sections and stuff, which is really overwhelming. So what we try and do in terms of engagement is build these little mental models so that when I say risk, you guys are seeing the same mental models as me. This one here is one of a safety management system. It looks a little bit complex, but actually it's really simple when you think about it. It just explains the why, the who, the what, and the how, and the when, we've got to be able to drive performance from these safety management systems. And I look at it like a Swiss watch. And I'm going to use this diagram here. So we get rid of this one. I'm hoping you guys can see up the back there. But this is a Swiss watch here. It's a system. Each of these cogs here in the system are turning in unison. And in unison, like a Swiss watch, when the clocks turn in unison, we get the correct time. If any of these teeth slip, or if any of these clogs are not actually aligned, then we won't get the output of the correct time. So we can use this analogy to explain what a safety management system is. And actually your risk framework, your safety management plan, your training plan are all little cogs in this Swiss watch. And if they're not working for you, we can take those cogs out. We can change that cog and put it back in. But we need to have a baseline. We need to be able to measure performance. So although this diagram here, let me get it back up, looks a little bit complex, really, these pieces here are the bits we measure. Like when I go to the doctors. If I go to the doctors and he wants to give me a health check, he measures my pulse, he measures my temperature, he looks in my throat. I call those the vital signs. These little buckets here are the vital signs of an organisation. If we can understand how to measure these vital signs of an organisation and compare them to the goals, strategics, objectives and actions that come from the strategic level of the organisation, then we've actually got a baseline to measure performance from. This stuff costs a lot of money, so we should be able to drive performance from it. The whole point of measuring is to collect data, and data is actually meaningless. Data means nothing. I was a safety manager for the Sea King fleet of helicopters, and I had 14, 15 databases full of data. I didn't know what to do with it. I had no clue what to do with it. Nobody had looked at it for years, but we just collecting data. So I came to the conclusion that I'm not going to use any of that data for the next 6 months. And not one person asked me, where is that data, Jimmy, from that database? So I had to start and rebuild again. So I went to my boss and says, look, boss, these databases, they're just collecting information and nobody's using it. Nobody's fusing the data together and making it meaningful so that we can prove safety performance. What do you want me to do? He says, I'll tell you what, Jimmy, answer these 3 questions. Where's the risk? What are you doing about it? And how do you know it's working? So I built a safety management system on those 3 questions. And actually, they're really clever questions. From a strategic level, they're really good questions. So how do you know it's working? So at some point in the safety management system, at each layer of the organisation, data has to flow. Then someone has to fuse that data and make sense of that data. And I suppose, why? Well, to be honest, we need to make decisions and actually get system performance and information. Where are we? Where are we now in controlling risks? And how do we compare? These are really simple questions that we should be demanding performance from our safety management system on. You know, and there's a little bit of when we do it, project milestones, change, importance, frequency. But straight away you can see on one slide, we can put the importance and make the relevance of a safety management system connect with the people. So a combination of that slide there, notwithstanding the minions, where you fit in, and actually how you manage where you fit in, is a really powerful way without using any words or any complex language that gets people on the same page. And hopefully it will get people to engage. Any questions there, or does that kind of make sense? We do use system performance, especially in safety management terms, to make a lot of important decisions. So we've got to make sure we validate that and stress test it. We've got to stress test the fact that we make risk-based decisions on monitoring of our risk system. And that could be decisions to spend money, it could be decisions to lay people off. It could be important strategic business decisions. So we've got to make sure we get it right. So getting someone on the same page and building a mental model of how your safety management system works is important. And something like this, without too many words and making it over complex, really does work. I've done a bit of work on measuring performance, and I use this diagram quite often, because everyone measures outcomes. They measure key performance indicators. But what people forget is that actually you've got to set goals and targets in order for an outcome to be meaningful. And those goals and targets can be safety goals and targets. And actually, there's only 3 measures of performance. You've got economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. And if you want to say that you're effective and all the money you're spending in this system is being used effectively, you need some way of answering these questions. Were we effective in achieving the goals measured by the outcomes? Did we need to go to this expense? And did we use our resources efficiently? It sounds quite a tough challenge, but it's actually pretty simple. If we want reactive and lagging indicators of the system, we'll just only measure the outcomes. And we do this a lot with sort of lost time injury frequency rates and stuff. They're inherently poor for gauging performance of a system. And if you're engaging with your middle management and senior management, we should try and make that sort of connection. If you want to be a bit smarter about it and save some money, then we should use proactive and leading indicators. What that means is we've got to actually come down the chain and we start to measure inputs and process. Once we've done that, we'll have a good mix of leading and lagging indicators, and actually we'll have a good measure of performance. And we'll actually know if this system is working to its full extent, and we'll be able to drive performance from it. Okay, I've got a bit of a game. So I need you guys to help me, because I'm very nervous. You guys ain't. So I'm putting responsibility on you to help me get through this. Got a bit of a risk game. So if I say this is risk, I hope you don't mind if I pick you to maybe help me get through this risk game. Risk from 1 to 10, I'm going to just say parachuting. How risky is parachuting, do you think? Can I just ask you, please, Glenn? How risky is parachuting on a scale of 1 to 10? 8. So Glenn's up at 8. I'm going to say 2. I've done it. Okay, I'm going to say 2. I'm going to say parachuting's 2. Anyone else want to go with Glenn? Mark, do you have, where's parachuting in terms of your risk threshold? Where would you say it was?
I would say it'd be a 2.
A 2? So have you done it before?
No.
No. So Glenn and Jimmy are at 2. And, sorry, you're Mark, sorry. Mark is at 2. And Glenn's up here at 8. Anyone else? Could I ask you to maybe say, where would parachuting be in your risk threshold? 10, so you're up here. What's your name, sorry? Kathy? You're up at 10. The whole point of this exercise is to look at the spread. Risk assessment is based really on emotion. There's a whole bunch of driving factors in risk assessing. It's not a single person's job, it's a team event. If you do it as a team event, you'll lose subjectivity. That's why we need frameworks to assess risk, because it's based on your age, your experience, your sex, and your religion. And that's just biology. You can't get away from that. So actually, having a team together who make risk assessments within your organisation and providing a little bit of background on the sort of principles of risk assessing, using simple games like this is actually a very engaging way of getting them to read a process. I would much rather do this and make a fool of myself in front of people and get them to get the message and get the sort of right mental model in their head before they go away and risk assess. I'd much rather do it this way. There's other things about risk. There's acceptable risk and there's unacceptable risk. And actually, and Heather will back me up, but if you do a risk assessment, because they're inherently subjective, the judge and jury won't even look at it if it goes wrong. They'll look at your precautionary approach that you took. So actually, we've got to get these things right. We've got to get them accurate. So to make them less subjective, if myself, Glenn, Mark, and Katie sat in the room, we could actually, through my experience, through Glenn's experience, through Mark's experience, we could actually come up with something really, really sensible in terms of realistic risk assessment and close that gap. That is a meaningful risk assessment, which will be less subjective. And actually, what it does mean is, and I'm not picking anybody here, if I had to go with Glenn's assessment, I'm going to spend far too much money on mitigation and controls and risk reduction activity. And if I go with, sorry, it's the wrong way around, I'm going to spend less money. If I go with Katie's assessment, I'm going to spend far too much. Far too much. So we've got to make this stuff work for us as well. So engaging with your subject matter experts and having a good spread is a really good way of making this risk assessment stuff work for you. So any questions on that? I would like this to be two-way. If there's anything that I've said that you think, oh, I don't quite agree with that, it's great to be challenged as well, to be honest. It makes it much more enjoyable.
Just a question.
Yep.
The person who ranked at 10 may have information or experience that everybody else hasn't got.
Yes.
So does that get weighted then accordingly?
No, I think that's a really good point. What it allows us to do is get everyone on the same page in terms of having all of the information. So what normally happens is, and again, it's biology. If I've got one person, I hope you can see this, that's my range of information that I have on parachuting. And then we go to the number 2 person, He's got that range of information on parachuting. And 3, that range. And then you start debating and asking questions. Well, where's the context? The one thing that gives risks is context, is activity. But you need to have some context. I've actually got that much information when I make my risk assessment, rather than just this single viewpoint. So I think it's really important to take into consideration all the factors, all the views, but ultimately make a decision, because we can't have them being talking shops. We've got to have meaningful risk decisions. So yeah, I think to answer your question, it would never be discarded, but it's something that goes on the table in order to make your risk assessment less subjective.
There might be one person who actually has all the information.
Exactly, 100%. And that's why I always say risk assessment is, I mean, it's very few, in a complex organisations, I think there's very few organisations where one person holds the key to all the information, I must say. So I do think that this exercise is actually, if you're going to set up a risk control system or a risk management system or a risk escalation system as part of your safety management system, actually getting everyone on the same page on risk is a good thing. I don't think there's too many training courses for risk, to be honest.
Can I put my regulator's hat on for a second?
Yep.
There are some areas where the prevailing standard, particularly the standard prescribed in legislation, has already done the risk assessment for you, because it's taken into account the fact that some things are low incidence, but such high consequence that there are strict rules about how you have to manage it. So, for example, entry into confined spaces.
100%.
It doesn't happen a lot, but when it goes wrong in a big way.
Well, and the whole...
So that's why the law's so strict.
Yeah, and I get that, and it's a great point again. But for me, regulation constrains my behaviour. So if I'm going to do confined space entry, all you've done is constrain my behaviour in terms of here's some hard and fast rules you just cannot get away from. But I mean, in terms of the risk assessment then, well, that's a different beast. Those rules and regulations need to be taken into consideration, but it's all about the context. Context is so important. So the cut and paste of the last risk assessment doesn't really quite work in the eyes of the law, the legislation. But yeah, you can get away from some of the hard and fast rules that legislation imposes. But actually, when you think about it, context is the driver.
It's a complicated area, isn't it? Because experience alone can't drive. We're talking about sharing experience, and in areas where there's no finite standard, that has to be done. It's so valuable. But experience alone can't drive in so many of these circumstances. As an inspector, I would regularly get told by people, you know, look, I know we've got guys working 6 metres off a concrete slab with no fall protection, but I've been in this industry for 35 years and we've never had a problem.
Yeah.
The problem is when you do have a problem, there's going to be a guy who has to be scraped up off the concrete.
Yeah.
And the law says don't care if you've never had a problem for 35 years. So experience is kind of, it's problematic, isn't it, in terms of how much it needs to sway decision making.
100%. And there's some critical thinking an organisation can't do without. And that critical thinking piece is exactly that piece there. It's understanding the rule book. Going back to the rules, what does the rule book say? At every step, your first stage is, what does the rule book say? What obligations does the rule book put on me? So I think that's a really good point, but there's so many organisations that outsource that critical thinking and don't actually retain it. So I've worked with a large water company in Melbourne, probably, and they outsource diving operations, but you know they struggle with internally to understand what a good diving operation looked like and what a bad diving operation looked like.
And they haven't worked out.
Exactly.
Contracting it out doesn't absolve them of the
Exactly. That's why this risk assessment piece is really important. With a little bit of training, you can actually navigate around the rule book.
I mean, there is another side to that coin.
Yep.
It's my experience that managers, senior managers who are far removed from the operational activity of a hazardous activity, such as working at heights, they tend to be more risk averse about the processes or the standards involved in working at heights. And whereas they don't lean enough on the experience, the training, and the competence of the people who actually carry out the work. So therefore they impose a lot tougher and more rigorous processes on those people who have to work at heights. And I think, I personally don't think that's effectiveness.
I think you're right. I think in terms of that example, what a great example, I think you're up at this end of the scale. But what normally happens, and biology tells us and research tells us, that uncertainty creates high risk or low appetite for risk. Uncertainty. It's the uncertainty piece that creates a low appetite for risk. So getting people in the room with experience and knowledge and understanding of the rules will mean that more information is available, will hopefully remove that uncertainty that's been created by just a lack of understanding or knowledge of the operation. So getting rid of uncertainty is key, and a less subjective risk assessment. And we can use these diagrams, like we've done here. For me, this is really engaging because hopefully I'm learning, and hopefully everyone's learning. So reading a risk assessment process won't work. It won't cut the mustard in terms of engagement, but actually doing something like this and taking the time out in the workplace health and safety rep meeting and just playing a little game will hopefully engage the workforce and inform the workforce. Any other questions on risk?
Just a statement. I think risk assessments are highly overdone and misunderstood.
Yeah.
First of all, the Work Health and Safety Act doesn't require risk assessments except in some extraordinary situations,
Yep.
which are specified. Secondly, it requires people to undertake a task in the known way of doing it, if there is a standard way of doing something.
Yeah.
And most things that we do in our workplaces are done from day to day, day in out, and if they're not, we've got a risk assessment, we've got a known way of doing it for the industry. So the one-offs are actually quite rare. Now, you gave an example, a very good one. Similarly, at the Ballarat College of CAE, when it was, they wrote an article. They had a number of students do risk assessments that were studying for their graduate diploma in risk assessments. And none of them could agree on the assessment,
Yep.
let alone the methodology, let alone a whole range of other things. So when we start talking about risk assessments, I think our focus is actually in the wrong spot. It's a matter of, is there a known, safe way of doing this? What are the reasonable controls we can put in place? Let's put in place the best controls we can put in place that are reasonably practical for our situation and keep the costs down and move on with it.
I agree. And I think I can rebut that a little bit by saying, oh, the law drives us down that road anyway. The so far as reasonably practicable definition means that there is a 5-point objective test when it comes to risk-based activity. You've got to pass that 5-point objective test.
In general, that process complies.
That process does comply, but if you use one of the standards like ISO 31000, then using the hierarchy of controls, you almost get the same thing. The reason I mention risk assessment here is because that's how daily we manage your business in an organisation in high-risk environments. So it kind of makes that connection. But there's inherent flaws with risk assessment. I think we exposed some of that here. You know, it can be subjective. You do need the SMEs sat around the table. And actually, we should be taking not a hazard-based approach, but a precautionary approach. That's what the law demands. I've just done a lot of work with the Air Force on this as well. I've just actually came from Adelaide yesterday, where I briefed a whole bunch of an engineering team and telling them, okay, then where do we fit in with this technical risk assessment? Well, you fit in here, but actually your systems and processes today are not adequate. They do not meet the SFARP 5-point objective test, which is pretty clear in the legislation. But it's a really good point. That was great. Good bit of debate. That was excellent. Thank you. I do want to cover this concept because I love this concept. It's one of my favourite books. It doesn't quite fit in the presentation, but I thought I should get it in. We use risk assessment really to drive decision-making in the organisation and also meet some of our obligations. So there's a book called Drift to Failure by a guy called Sidney Dexter. And he's an Aussie, and he's an engineer, I think, and a pilot. Far too clever for his own good, far too clever for his own good. And what he says is that our organisation has these parameters, and they're performance parameters, and their tolerances. And if we work within those parameters, we're pretty good. We're pretty good. And let me give you an example. I worked with a truck company not so long ago when this was happening. They actually had laid down parameters and performances for maintenance. And the maintenance has been extended and not done. So what was actually happening in real life is they were drifting from the predetermined parameters and tolerances that they had set themselves in order to provide safe performance. And organisations do this by default. We do this. And then what happened then is they've eroded some sort of safety margin. So let me just get this diagram in a bit of perspective. This is a toilet roll tube. Let's say it's a tube. And the blue line is saying that we're operating inside the tube, and all's good. We're hitting our tolerances and our performance levels that we should be in order to provide safe performance. And then we do something like extend a little bit of maintenance on trucks. And then that becomes the new normal. But we don't know how far we've eroded the safety margin. But actually, in eroding that safety margin, we're getting closer to a catastrophic event. But actually, then we say, hey, we got away with that, extending that maintenance. Let's keep extending maintenance.
Nothing happened.
And nothing happened. Exactly what you said. And then let's just say, let's then set up our system, our quality system, to the new parameters. So actually, it's a blind spot. The organisation, the quality management system, the safety management system doesn't actually see the fact we've extended beyond the safety margin or how far into the safety margin we've actually went. And there's lots of high-profile accident scenarios that actually fall with this. And by default of being a complex organisation, you naturally progress this way. You will erode the safety margin doing some activity and not truly understand where you are until this happens. Until you erode the margin to a point, and that could be people. That could be just putting workload on your people. So your people are performing really, really safely, and they're comfortable, and their physical and mental safety is great. The quality of the physical safety is great, and the quality of the mind is great. And then you just add a little bit of workload, and that becomes the new normal. Then you add a workload to a point that the person has a breakdown, or you really break the person. Same as trucks, it's the same analogy. The point is, it's called drift. It's a great concept to just have in your back pocket as a tool, as a safety professional, and say, yeah, can we recognize this drift? Do we need something in an organization that recognizes this drift? Any questions on that? Does that make sense?
Just one question. To what extent do you think that's linked to people's tendency to test boundaries for legitimacy?
I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't test boundaries. I think we should push. The organisation will change anyway through time. Organisations just do not stand still because that first slide was political driver, economic drivers, which means we stress test our working practice.
Yeah. I mean informally, people do it. It's an individual action. So with the drift, the people, individual employees start to do things, outside.
So take emails home, work at home. Yes, things like that. Well, I don't know if you know, there's a bit of a movement back in Europe, Volkswagen. I wouldn't buy one of their cars. But if you're an eco-warrior, I wouldn't buy one of their cars. But Volkswagen back in Germany are the first organisation to turn off their servers at night time. People will not receive work emails at night time because they recognise this. But let's face it, people will do what they do to feel fulfilled. If it is an extra couple of hours at night time and that's what makes you tick and you want to get promoted, then people will do it. That's not good enough.
They're making you do it.
It does. It does.
People will do what gets rewarded. In organisations, people will do what pleases the people above them.
Yep.
So the people above them, if they want to drive people in the right direction, need to recognise the right things, reward the right things, instead of the right
I agree.
things. Otherwise, they're creating
Yep.
the behaviour. Rewarding production managers for exceeding production levels, but kill the production workers who work those shifts because they're driving them.
No, that's a really good point.
You've got to look at what you're measuring because you can, in fact, produce the behaviour that you say you don't want. An organisation that turns off its servers at night so that people can't do work at home.
Fantastic.
That's an extraordinary.
No, it's just happened. The other thing I would add to that point is the organisation will set the preconditions for this. And it's those preconditions that we need to set that says, hey, let's police this. Let's not have our people working 16 hours a day because it's unproductive anyway. When I keep getting asked, Jim, it's either safe or it's production, it ain't. The literature doesn't tell me that. All the literature I read is a safe environment that people feel physically and mentally safe will be more productive. Full stop. Every piece of literature, there's no piece of literature I've read, and I've read a lot, that says it's the other way around. So if our organisation is setting the preconditions for this, then we have a problem. We're not fulfilling our obligations. But it's a great model, and again, like I said, there's not too many words in this presentation, but these little mental models, hopefully, will stimulate a little bit of thought on how can we go and engage this message with our people. Leadership has got a huge part to play in engagement. It's cost-free, it costs absolutely nothing. This is the one thing, the paper system, the safety management system, the books, the processes, cost an absolute fortune. But in reality, I can put one of those in place in 3 or 4 weeks. But it costs a fortune. But that doesn't deliver safe outcomes. It's the people that deliver safe outcomes. So we've got to think about leadership. And there's a little top tip that I've, and this is a great clip. If you ever get the chance, read this clip. It's a great clip. It's called The Golden Circle. It taps into biology. We always talk about the what and the how, but not the why. If we want people to follow and act, we've got to talk to the why, because it connects with a different part of the brain. It's biology. It connects with a different part of the brain that's managed behaviour and feeling. So if I say to you, I need you to do a risk assessment because you're going in a confined space. There you go, there's a template. It's going to have a certain degree of credibility and legitimacy because it's going to be done. But if I say, hi Heather, I really want you to come to Melbourne tonight. I know your son's playing in that violin concerto tonight at the Melbourne Theatre. And by the way, you are in, and you need to do a bit of a risk assessment because your next job is that confined space entry. It's the same message, but it's a different way of marketing it. I've actually connected with Heather at a personal level using a part of the brain that she's more inclined to actually act on rather than the language part of the brain, the lower cortex. So a little bit of biology is always handy when it comes to being a safety professional. Understand people's fallibilities and how they work. So we've got to, if next time, and it's a bit of a challenge, I suppose, for me, when you relay a safety message, start with the why. Start with the why it's important. Then work from the inside out, because normally we communicate and act from the outside in. And that's where we lose people and not connect with people. Any questions on that? Because it's all about this traffic light system. Again, if we want to talk about engagement and safety leadership, we've got to talk about change management. I love this model, Cut-Lewin model. It's an ice cube, okay? It's called freeze the ice cube, unfreeze the ice cube, and freeze ice cube to a new shape. That's change. It's a classic change model. It's a great little model. But actually, any process that we want to be followed, whether it be a new process or an existing process, if we don't actually understand the biology behind it and how people work, we'll never be followed. So we've really got to understand this. I call it the traffic light system. These things are ingrained, beliefs and values. This thing will change depending on your environment. Okay, I've done stuff that I'm not particularly proud of because of the peer pressure and environment, because of the attitudes of the environment that I don't believe I have value in. I left my last organisation, shouldn't really put this in camera, because they didn't believe that, because I believed the way of doing stuff and they didn't believe that, so I just left because I wasn't prepared to stay there. So these are really important. These are the deep down beliefs and values you have, driven by age, religious tendencies, sex, the environment. They're all driven, your parents, your parenting style. These are all driven and inherent in who we are. And we've got to understand this piece in order to create that safety culture that influences behaviour. So these are the signals that give direction and meaning and purpose to our lives. It's who we are. And we've got to really tap into that if we want to engage in safety principles and practices. Change management is a bit of a minefield, but that leadership, change management, and safety knowledge is the three key tenets in terms of engaging your people. That's what I believe. And some of these little models. I've just got a bit of an example. I've just done a bit of work with the Navy. I thought, how are we going to develop this safety communication strategy? So I've just wrote or helped to write over the last 3 years a regulatory framework for the Navy, the Australian Navy. I shouldn't say Royal Navy, it's the Australian Navy. And we had to get together and come up with some goals and objectives at an enterprise level. So really senior management in there. And I thought, well, I've got senior management in there, I've got sailors in there. If I give them a follow the bouncing ball process, they will just not follow it and I'll lose them within 2 or 3 minutes. So we drew a sailor in the middle and we gave them a checklist because they're used to checklists. I wrote the checklist in their language, but it had all the key bits in there that I needed them to follow in order to get this outcome of this communication strategy. So it's just a way of presenting information differently. And it really worked for us. And I'm happy to share that with you. It's a really good little strategy to get communications, really put some rigour behind it. So one thing to learn, I've done a bit of time in sales when I first came to Australia. I was pretty poor at it. I didn't know what I was selling. I got fired within 3 months. I didn't know what I was selling. I didn't know how much I was selling it for, and I didn't know who I was selling it to. But I did learn how to sell stuff and market stuff, which was great for me as a safety professional. An output here was this, a whiteboard full of chalks. But actually, from it, we got some really good results. So that process there, albeit simple, it led to a whole bunch of intellectual rigour that gave us the answer to which was a complex issue. But we've done it together, like we've done this presentation together. And for me, that's the essence of engaging and engagement. So that said, I am finished, and I'm happy to go back to the end of the slide to take some questions so that we can keep this engagement going. Any questions? Anybody want to stress test some of these models to say, hey, I fit in here, how does that fit in? And we'll try and work it through.
I'll raise an issue, Tim,
Yeah.
just to stop people thinking questions. It's not really an issue. You talked about, the need to do a risk assessment for mining science, space, entry, etc.
Yep.
And I think part of that engaging with people, people don't adhere to solutions to problems if they don't know that there's a problem. So one of your challenges as a health and safety professional is to get people to recognise that there's a problem.
Yeah.
But too much of the documentation stuff that people do because they think they're legal requirements, like documented risk assessments, which aren't, except for some circumstances, JSAs, SWIMs,
Yep.
all this, people seem to see them as an end in themselves. So you have contractors who have a whole bunch of SWIMs already filled out in the boot of their truck, and every job they arrive on, they pull one out, write
Yeah.
this job on it, and so if a regulator comes along and says, where's your SWIMs? Here's my SWIMs.
Yeah.
As though the production of the document is the objective of the exercise.
Yeah.
And completely losing sight of it's actually going through the process of preparing the document that is the objective.
Yeah.
The document just demonstrates that you've done it. So that is a real challenge in terms of in consultation processes to get people to actually understand that filling out a JSA or completing a SWIMS or whatever, it's actually the process going
It's a
through
great point.
that makes it safe,
Yep.
not the filling out of a piece of paper.
And that's a really good point, and I think it stems into your point about risk assessment and some of the subjectivity of risk assessment. That's why I say we should always start with the why.
Yes, why?
The what is the GSA. That's the end result. It's not the outcome. That's the what we need in order for you to conduct and reach the safety performance levels that we want. So if we start with the why, that generally helps we turn it on its head. It's all about critical thinking and structuring people's thinking around these issues. People get complacent. We know that.
Getting people to say, the idea is to stand back and say, well, okay, this is what I'm going to do. What could go wrong here?
Yeah, exactly.
If it goes wrong, how bad could it be?
Yeah.
And what sort of things could I do to try and stop that from happening? And at the end of the day, that's what proactive risk management is.
It is.
It isn't complicated words or bits of paper or whatever. It's actually about, hey, before I start, what could go wrong?
And do you know what? It's a really good point. It sort of segues onto my last little bit here. I'm hoping you can see this. Safety management system. Part of the safety management system, your risk assessment process. It's not the be and end all. The black box is the one bit here. It's I'm just going to kid on this as a safety management system. It's an ISO 4801 safety management system. It's documented in a plan, sat right there. The black box is absolutely useless if we don't actually attack these green boxes. And the first one up here is active leadership. It's always the first one. The paper system will never, ever work or operate or get performance from it if you don't have active leadership. And I've got another, this is just from my experience and some of the stuff that goes wrong in terms of why are people not doing it? Why are people not critically thinking for themselves? Manage competence. You mentioned there's no point putting people in positions and organisations that are not competent to manage it. And actually that goes for the risk control system. If you've got a risk control system and process that is not competent in capturing your activity because your activity's changed and that confined space entry risk assessment performer was designed 10 years ago, it's not competent. It's not competent enough to manage the environment you're working in today. The other one is here is that robust assurance, and I don't mean audit here. Audit's a means to an end. What I mean here, robust assurance from everyone in the organisation. Make it socially unacceptable to not do the right thing. I wouldn't walk in here naked today. I may have done when I was back in the military, but not today, because it's a fairly respectable audience. However, it's socially unacceptable for me to do that. And we can actually drive behaviour so that it becomes socially unacceptable to not take time over that risk assessment. The other one's the culture, and I think we all know how important culture is. Culture drives those attitudes on that slide here. Yeah? Culture drives this bit. And hopefully it aligns with this bit. But the culture, bad cultures don't align with this bit. Good cultures do align with this bit. And the last bit here is a supportive capability. When how many times you see this poor safety professional is still working Office 2002, if there was such a thing, with an old computer that actually it's not fit for purpose. The organisation, if it wants performance from its safety system and its people, have got to invest some money. And I can do lots of simple calculations, give you guidance on how to work at that return on investment. Because you already put 3 business cases up today on one of your first slides. The moral business case, the legal business case, and the compliance business case. We've got to do it. You know, some stuff you can't get away from.
So our next surprise speaker is Geoff Pearman, and he's the Managing Director of Partners in Change, a trans-Tasman organisational workforce development consultancy. Over the past 4 years, Geoff has worked with over 50 companies ranging in size from 34,000 to owner-operators to assist them address the challenges and opportunities of age and work. Geoff is currently working with 30 Tasmanian organisations through the Ageing Workforce Cluster program. So Geoff is going to give us his thoughts about the role of consultation engagement with ageing workforces. Thank you.
Okay, Pam, well, thanks very much for the welcome, and it's great to be here with you. Jimmy just mentioned that he doesn't want to walk in here feeling naked. I've walked in feeling naked without a tie when I had a look around and saw Jimmy wearing a tie. And part of that was I've just come from a building company. And as Pam said, we're working with something like 25, 30 businesses here in Hobart, particularly around Hobart, around ageing workforce issues. And one of the things that we do at the end of the program is actually spend 2 hours in the company and talk about the sort of challenges that they're facing, the action plan they're putting in place. And so this morning I was actually out on the job, which was absolutely fantastic. Well, the invitation was to talk about engagement in the context of ageing workforces. And what that has really given me the opportunity to do, there's 2 things that I do in my business, really probably about 90% of my work is age and work, but the other 10% is working in the whole area of stakeholder engagement. So it really just gave me an opportunity to bring those together and share a few frameworks with you. So what I want to talk about is really drawing out some distinctions between stakeholder engagement and stakeholder management. And in there is a lot of confusion. And you'll make these connections to work health and safety. I'll allow you to make those. I simply want to give you some frameworks for teasing this out and getting some clarity and getting some of the language sorted out. I then want to just talk for a few minutes about engaging with an ageing workforce, rather than, I'm sick and tired of hearing people talk about managing an ageing workforce. I'm sorry, I do not want to be managed, I want to be engaged with. And so I'll tease that out a little bit. And then I want to just finish out by talking about having conversations that really matter for people. So one of the questions that we often ask is, who is our stakeholders? And it's the same phrase that you hear. And certainly a number of the writers in these sort of areas have written very elaborate discussions and definitions of who your stakeholders are. I've got a simple definition that's only about 8 words. And a stakeholder is anybody who can make or break your business. So that's a good place to start thinking about the stakeholder as being anybody who can make or break your business. If they start to do that, you end up with this massive array of people who can just do that for you. They can damage your reputation. They can do all sorts of things to you. They can actually, in fact, be your best ambassadors. But they are the people who can make or break your business. What I want to share with you now is a way, in actual fact, of starting to think through that. So you might have a couple of 100 people sitting in that whole stakeholder thing. That's a lot to work with. And so typically what you find organisations do when they develop a stakeholder, and they often call it an engagement plan, and it's got absolutely no engagement in it, it's often more a communication plan, is they actually start up here with this notion of what we want to do is to communicate. So this framework is really the 3 C's in a way of breaking this down and thinking about how do we work with the people who are important to us in terms of our organisation. I just want to run this through, and again, like Jimmy, I can make this available to you for you to use. But certainly if we look at the communication, the methods that are often used by organisations in terms of communicating with people, and they say engaging, are things like briefings, public relations, and one-directional communication. And the key message that sits in there, and I think these key messages are the ones that you want to probably take away. The key message that sits there around communication strategies with your stakeholders are, we're going to tell you what we've been thinking and what we've decided. And so what that does for people who are on the receiving side of that, whether they're your staff, whether they're colleagues, whether they're stakeholders or external to you, is they simply become observers. And potentially that creates a passivity. And it creates a take it or leave it attitude. And I guess, Jim, in terms of Jimmy's framework and Sinek's work, it doesn't appeal to the why. It doesn't appeal to the who they are because they actually haven't been engaged in the process. And I would really characterise that very much as a paternalistic framework. We know best, and we will tell you what we're going to do. If you jump down to the second C, which is consult, my view is consultation is an overused method that is having less and less impact. And often what consultation is doing in organisations and communities now is actually creating a lot of passive-aggressive behaviour. Now, I'll just give you an example. If your managing director or chief executive came to you today and said, we're going to do an organisational restructuring and we're going to consult with you, what would be your reaction? Just a few people, what would be your reaction? Already made the decision. Okay, someone else. Anybody else got another variant on that? Typically, that's the reaction. I've been a manager. I've been a director. I've undertaken organisational change, and I can tell you that that is not the case. The decision hadn't already been made. In actual fact, the definition of consultation is that I need to engage you in good faith and take on board and consider what you've done in terms of the decision I make. But do you believe me? No. And what consultation does is when you start to talk to people about consulting, in actual fact creates that sort of passive-aggressive behaviour. So if we come in here, often what's used there is discussion documents, submissions, hearings, decisions, and the key message there is not, we will tell you what we've been thinking and decided, which you think it is, they're just communicating, but tell us what you think about what we've been thinking about. We've already been doing some thinking, we want to now know what you think about it. What that does is it actually turns your people into advocates. And what some of the theorists are now saying about this is that actually what consultation does is it creates win-lose situations. Why have we got the emergence in our political systems of advocates, of people who are lobbyists? Because of consultation. Because they know they've actually got to get there and influence the decision makers. They're not part of the shaping process, they're part of the influencing of the decision. And often the outcome of consultation is compromise. But it's turned your people into advocates for a view or a position. The assumption sitting in there is it's expert-based. We are the experts. We will give you the best that we can. Now, what do you think about what we've been thinking about? The place that I'm really much, much more interested in, the place we need to move to is the third C. And that's the place of collaboration or co-creation. And what that's saying, the methods that are often used there are methods which are much more dialogue-based, methods that are based on conversation, deliberative thinking, and joint problem solving. So the key message you're getting there is, we've actually got a situation that we need to do some work on. Come join us. Come help us do some thinking, and we may in actual fact extend the opportunity for you to be part of that decision making. But come help us solve the problem. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a company this morning, a medium-sized company. They've got a particular challenge with an ageing worker, and where the executive were getting to was they were going to use consultation. They were going to go and talk to this person and say, look, we've been doing some thinking about what's happening for you in terms of your work performance. What do you think about what we've been thinking? Now, he will just probably tell them to stuff off. He'll just get threatened and he'll tell them to go somewhere else. What I've been encouraging him to do is actually go and sit down with this person and say, you've been a part of this company for a long time, you're a valuable contributing worker, we've been noticing some stuff, we want to sit down and have a talk to you and see if we can find a way through this together. So what the basis of that is you're inviting people not to become observers or advocates, but you're inviting people to become partners in the problem solving and in the solution. And what it is a much more justice-based approach. It's approach that's based on equity and recognition of the value and the contribution of the other person. So that's just one framework that I want to share with you. The second framework I want to share with you is now pulling this through into action. So on this model here along the bottom, we've got the typical stuff we know. So we all know about briefings. You know, we're going to tell you what we've already decided. Don't ask questions, just listen. We all know about networking, that's called drinking coffee. We all know about liaison, so we appoint liaison people who go out and drink coffee. We all know about consultation because we're pretty experts at doing that. But we don't know a lot about these things, but we try them. So here we are applying the 3 C's to it. Up this side of the matrix is the intensity of the relationship. Along here are some other dimensions. Now, my view is that if you work it down at this end, then the intensity of the relationship is pretty low. It doesn't demand too much of you if we're to stand up in front of 100 people and tell them, does it? It doesn't demand a little bit more if you get out there and do some of the networking stuff. Where's this gone? Oh, there it is. If you're doing the networking stuff in here. But when you start to move up into this space here, where it's collaboration and partnership, the intensity of the relationship increases. So one of the things that we find is if you're going down here, you can have many, many relationships. They're often simple. Up here, they're complex, and you have fewer. So when you're sitting there faced with these 200 stakeholders, one of the things I often recommend to organisations is put every stakeholder's name on a post-it label, then get up at a whiteboard and draw 3 columns and say, where are we going to put these people? Because there will be some where you just want to communicate. There'll be some where you will want to consult. Tell us what you think about what we've been thinking about. But there'll be some who you'll want to invite into a partnership where you co-create the solutions. This, in my view, this side of the line is what we call stakeholder management, and this side here is what we call stakeholder engagement. So that's just a simple framework which I've given you in 5 minutes, and it usually takes a day course to develop and expand on. Part of the frustration of doing this. Okay, let's flick over now to talking about older employees. And this is a wonderful quote from a woman called Lara Marcos, who's written a lot about diversity and introducing diversity into cultures and organisations. And she says, and you might want to actually follow this through and answer the response for her. Imagine you're in your 50s, 60s or 70s. What would your workplace look like? And then she says, no matter what would you look like? What role will you be playing in your organisation, and what kinds of work will you be doing? As the future takes shape, the question becomes, what are organisations imagining and planning for us? And hence my point right at the beginning, older workers want to be engaged and not managed. They want to be engaged in a collaborative process about what the future work might be for them and what the job design is around the work that they're doing and their participation. What are organisations planning for us? We're falling right back to the paternalistic expert model. And that was what I encountered this morning in some ways, was that managing director had worked out what he thought was a solution for this guy. And he hadn't sat with the guy and said, what's important to you and your family at this stage in your life? What are your intentions? What are your aspirations? How can we work this out together and find a way forward through the next stage that deals with some of the physical issues that you've got, but also addresses some of the financial concerns that you've got and respects the loyalty that you've had to our company. Businesses need to recognise that in the future, competition will be for workers rather than jobs. Demography is driving that. We know that we've had a declining birth rate. We know that we've got the boomers who are coming through. The youngest boomer is now, about 50, 51. The oldest is about 70. So we've got the boomers coming through. They're staying at work longer. The competition is going to be, in actual fact, for workers. An employer already working with you is probably going to be more valuable than trying to get someone new, and you may not be able to find them. Allowing an employee to retire without exploring the options to keep them for longer is, in actual fact, probably very much a wasted opportunity. And I guess this takes me to that point, is don't make assumptions about what your older workers are thinking and what their intentions are. What we do know is older workers are staying on at work a lot longer. They're staying on, as I always say, through choice, because they love the work they will do, there's a sense of purpose, they want to keep contributing, but increasingly a lot of older workers are staying on through necessity. And often that's through financial necessity. And some of that necessity has got good basis to it, and some of that necessity is in actual fact ignorance-based. and a place for education. So, do you know what your people, what the people you work with want and need to remain in the workforce? What will you need when you get to that stage, and many of you may well be at that stage, from your workplace? Don't make assumptions. Don't fall into the model of communicate. Don't even fall into the model of consult. I guess the view that I take is sit down and have a conversation. Now, interestingly around that is, why don't we have the conversations? So many times I've worked with groups, and I'll work with groups of employers and managers, and they'll say to me, I'd love to be able to sit down with my older workers and talk about this stuff. And so we say, well, why? And we get a list, and I'm going to go through that in a minute. Then I'll sit down and do some work with a group of older employees, and many of them would say, I'd actually, if I'm really honest, I'd like to be able to have a conversation with my boss, with my manager, with my employer, but it just don't happen. And so we end up with no speaks. So employees want to, but what they're concerned about is, if I raise this issue, what's going to happen? I did some work with a government agency back in Wellington in New Zealand, and a senior executive in that particular organisation thought they were doing the right thing, and they probably were. About 6 months before they were going to exit and leave the workplace, they announced that that's what they were going to be doing. What immediately happened was that person was sidelined. They weren't invited into new projects. They weren't taken into confidence around particular information. What message do you think that sent in the rest of the organisation? What would it tell you? Don't tell them, because you're going to get marginalised, you're going to be put to one side. So the behaviour that very quickly emerged in that organisation was people gave minimal notice. What was the consequence of that? Well, one of the risks that emerged from that was a lot of knowledge walked out the door very quickly. It damaged their reputation as an organisation. It damaged trust in the organisation. People think this through. What happens if I tell the organisation this is what my thinking is, or I even want to have a discussion about what the next 5 years might be for me? What will happen? Really important that organisations are sending clear messages about that. Can I trust? What are my options? So one of the things that we find many, many times in talking to older workers is that they actually don't know what their options are. So even if you go into space of flexible working, what's the typical thing that someone will ask for first in terms of flexible working? Someone? Part-time hours. It's always the one that comes up. So someone may be feeling a little tired, they may be feeling a little jaded, they may have other things in their life that they want to do. Their first approach often will be is, can I go part-time? In actual fact, we did an exercise yesterday in terms of listing down all the options that there are around flexibility. You can get to 20 or 30 different options. People don't know those. And so one of the issues, I think, is that organisations need to do much more education and awareness to help people understand what some of their options are as they start to think about this stage in their life. And the many, many people we've worked with, typically, I think that there's 3 groups of people who are over the age of 50, and the research tends to support this too. What we have is we have a group who are the planners. So there'll be people in your organisation who are planning, who have got a sense of where they want to go. I'm being really generous when I say this is about 20% of people over the age of 50. It's probably much more around 15%, 12, 15%. Of people who have some form of plan in place, and I'm not just talking about a financial plan. They have some sort of sense of what the next 5 years is, what the next 10 years is, and how they're going to manage that transition through. The next 80% are people who are perplexed and absolutely confused. And the media and the politicians do nothing to help that. People are confused about what this next stage is about, what their options are, what their entitlements are, and how they put it together, and so they don't do anything about it. And then what we've got is the other group, who are the procrastinators, who always keep putting it off. Now you'll have, probably in your workplace, that'll probably be about 80%, 85% of your employees who are older workers. The thing that they won't do, and I'm really clear about this, and we know this, and I've talked to many superannuation companies about this, is often companies think, okay, what we're going to do is we've got all these older workers, we'll run retirement planning seminars. Do you know who goes? The planners. They go because they actually want to make sure they've got their plans tickety-boo. They want to make sure that they're getting the last dollar that they can get. These people don't go because it's too confusing, and these people don't go because they can't get their act together about anything. What we're finding is we actually engage these two groups through having conversations and inviting them in and engaging them in conversations. Okay, let's have a look at the employers. So what's the deal there? Well, many employers want to be able to talk with their older workers and engage with them. But sometimes it doesn't happen because the manager might be in their 30s or 40s, and how do you raise this subject with someone who could be the age of your parents and talk about the stuff in the workplace? So that barrier gets in the road. Well, but then, actually, your manager might be the same age, but you've worked for the company for a long time and your mates, and you might joke about this over a beer, but can you sit down and have a serious discussion about it because actually you haven't sorted it out for yourself? And all sorts of personal stuff starts to get in the road. So it doesn't happen. The third reason it doesn't happen, and we talk to people about this and they tell us, is because they don't want to offend. And what I would say, if you're in this position of wanting to talk to your older workers, I never talk to people about retirement. Yeah, it's the word that will just absolutely turn people off. What I would do, and I can ask Pam because I know Pam, but the question I'd say if I was sitting down and chatting with Pam or someone else, I'd be simply saying, so what's you thinking about the next stage in your life? And most of us have some thinking about that. And the next stage might include exit from the workforce, but in actual fact you might be saying to me, actually I'm thinking that I've got no plans to finish work, but I'd like to do a few other things, and that gets the conversation going. Do people know about the amygdala in here? The thing that triggers the fight-flight reaction? If you ask someone about retirement, it'll trigger this. And they'll go straight onto the defensive. But if you say to someone, you're a valuable part of this workplace, you're making a significant contribution, what we'd like to talk with you about is what you're thinking about the next stage of being with us, it's less likely to do this. What we say is avoid the amygdala hijack and look to how you engage. Now, there's a fourth reason why employers don't do it. Is anybody here an HR advisor? HR advisors don't like these conversations because they often have to deal with bullying complaints and people saying they've been discriminated against because up in here we actually haven't got our act together and we've said things that people get offended about. So the message goes out, don't have the conversation. The conversation is needed. We need to find ways in which to engage and talk with our older workers. Okay, so the kind of conversation that I'm interested in is one in which you start with a willingness to emerge a slightly different person. A wonderful quote from a guy called Theodore Zeldin. So if you're going into this as a manager or as a team leader, go in with a preparedness to emerge a slightly different person and to learn from the person that you talked about. Remember, this is about engagement. It's about partnering. It's not about communication. It's not about consulting. It's about actually engaging with the person. So what I talk about is actually how do you have a staying on conversation? How do you talk to someone? Because most older workers are afraid they're going to get a tap on the shoulder and have the moving on conversation. I remember working with an organisation, and one of the questions, just by the way, does Australia have a retirement age? Who thinks Australia's got a retirement age? Oh, come on, you're not brave enough. You do? Yeah, okay. We're going to have a talk later, Jimmy. Does anyone want to tell me Australia doesn't have a retirement age? No, it doesn't. Some professions do. But what Australia has is actually an age of entitlement to age pension. Not a retirement age. That went by the board a long time ago. But people still have that belief in their minds that there is an age of retirement. I was working in this organisation and I asked that question in a workshop, you know, do you have a retirement age? And a number of people, usually about a quarter of the people put up their hands, so there's probably about a quarter of people in here have been dishonest today. So usually about a quarter put up their hand and say, yes, there is a retirement age. And I made the point that no, there isn't. That woman, she went back to work, she was 67, she told me later. She went back to work, went straight down to the HR department and hugged them. And they wondered what it was about. From the age of 65 to 67, she had spent every day avoiding HR. Because she thought they were going to have the conversation. And it was going to be a moving on conversation. She had stuff going on in her life. She had had a late divorce. She didn't have a lot of super, which is often a common factor for some women. And she was needing to work, and she thought she was going to be put in the position. She went down and hugged them and said, "Thank goodness I can stay." And they said, "Well, yeah, what's the issue?" But that conversation hadn't started, which was a staying on conversation. And so I guess the point that I want to make is a staying on conversation is just as important to someone who's 25 as it is to someone who's 55, who's 65. Avoid the exit interview. Get on and have a staying on conversation. Engage with your older workers. Don't take the mindset that you've got to manage them. Engage with them. They want to be partners in addressing the issues that you face as an organisation and the challenges that they face in life. Thanks very much, Pam.
Thank you very much, Geoff. So now we're on to our final speaker, Mark Hocker, Director of Industry Safety, WorkSafe Tasmania, and he will talk to us about WorkSafe Tasmania's approaches into the future.
Hello colleagues, thank you Pam. Thank you all very much for coming along today. I'll try to be brief. I want to talk to you, with you today about engagement, education and enforcement, but from the regulator's perspective. I just have a few words to run through, so bear with me. So what I'm going to be really touching on today is facilitating problem solving and good regulatory decision making. From the regulator's perspective, the organisation is very much in a phase of transition and moving into a phase of consolidation in terms of our reach, impact, approach and style. So what we're currently doing at the moment is renewing our service delivery culture, with initial changes being made to our operational structure to incorporate designated teams to engage with industry and work between business to business clusters. This will result in WorkSafe operatives actively working with industry to seek sustainable solutions to health, safety and wellbeing issues rather than simply identifying areas of non-compliance. So a more proactive approach. Designated teams will work within the compliance domain to actively seek business-to-business cooperation prior to implementing escalating sanctions for identified and or ongoing compliance breaches or non-compliance issues. The WorkSafe Tasmania team will actively collaborate with business and industry on specific areas to build mature safety cultures, influence positive leadership change, attitudes and increase motivation by using data and evidence to empower business with information to take action, to improve the safety and health of their workers and their workplace. In line with this approach, a number of collaborative initiatives will be developed that take a more holistic and enabling approach to improving safety outcomes, with targeted and sustained industry engagement through industry action plans that contribute to reducing the incidence of work-related death, injury and disease. The action plans will be developed through industry consultation to identify activities to improve work health and safety and return to work outcomes for our targeted industry sectors. These will prove to be quite valuable for engaging with industry about issues and priorities. And the industry plans will be especially useful and quite helpful for our inspectorate and advisory members of our organisation to help identify key risks in key industry sectors. The traditional regulator focuses on hazard identification, enforcement through auditing, issuing notices and prosecution. The renewed WorkSafe Tasmania service delivery approach will focus more on the regulator becoming a facilitator or enabler through collaboration with business to improve safety outcomes and productivity. I've written these down so I don't forget the message, guys. So. This will result in a significant change in the way WorkSafe Tasmania operates, with the aim being a greater focus on cooperation and facilitation, leading to capacity building. Although coercive powers and sanctions will still be used, and they will be, they will more likely result from an escalation of response supporting our holistic compliance approach. Safety networks will be established to provide a forum for industry, very similar to the Better Work concept, to share knowledge and identify simple safety solutions to common problems within priority industry sectors, which at the moment include construction, healthcare, manufacturing, and agriculture, forestry and fishing. By adopting a collaborative partnership approach rather than a compliance approach, WorkSafe Tasmania will be able to better engage and build trust with and between business to work together to improve health and safety outcomes for all Tasmanians, because everyone deserves to go home healthy and safe from work. The approach that will be adopted by WorkSafe Tasmania can be best summarised as follows. We'll be adopting an evidence-based approach where data will drive our resource allocation and activities, where data and evidence will be used to empower industry with the intel, the knowledge, the information they need to set about implementing changes or improving safety outcomes. We will actively engage with industry and the community to make workplaces safer. We'll be engaging with industry and community in the safety culture debate. We'll be collaborating with business and industry to educate what compliance looks like, what's in it for their business in terms of return on investment, and how to build a mature safety culture. Targeted response, and there will be a targeted response from Curry to Cockle Creek and every other wooded vale in the colony. We'll be there. We'll be providing a responsive, high-quality service. We'll be focusing on high-risk industries and hazards, and where necessary, we will be using enforcement powers and prosecutorial action. Ladies and gentlemen, the focus for WorkSafe Tasmania is to be open, be responsive, to be engaging with the community, and we are there. An inspector is not there to hit people over the head with a big stick. An inspector is there to assist workplaces, to educate workers, to help achieve voluntary compliance. That's what our main focus is. Okay? The saying I have for my crew is you attract more flies with honey than what you do with vinegar. So a softly approach, but remembering, of course, the stick's inside your bag. So pull it out when you need to. So it's about engagement, it's about empowering, it's about taking ownership of the problem and sharing that problem with our industry partners and stakeholders. That's really all I have, Pam, unless anyone has any questions. Thank you.
Well, I guess that's nearing for us to wrap the session up. I hope you've enjoyed the morning's information and the providers. Of course, we had Heather at the beginning who, to me, very much highlighted the importance of consultation in terms of promoting ownership of work health and safety. That was a strong message I got from her presentation. With Jimmy, it was all about involving people and making them part of the whole process, which is critical to work health and safety. Geoff very clearly informed us and made us realise the importance of including and having a conversation with older workers and engaging them. And Mark has gone on to finish up to explain to us that the new WorkSafe Tasmania approach will be about a facilitation and enabling workplaces. So with that, of course, the future sessions for Better Work Tasmania, we're very much planning it to be collaboration, very collaboration type focus. So expect more and more these sessions to have some time together so that we can actually work on various issues. So we'll have information provision and then we'll spend time actually working together on issues and exploring possible solutions. So thank you very much again today for participating and being here, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.